The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. So I just want to remind you again, today is the third Sunday of the month, and on the third Sunday, it's an extended homily opened up to question and answer discussions afterwards. So put your thinking caps on. And I've actually amalgamated two pieces from Luke because it goes to the purpose that I want to address in the homily. Soon afterwards, Jesus went on through the cities and the villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as were some women, Mary called Magdalene, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided from them out of their own resources. After this, Jesus appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him into every town and place where he was about to go himself. He told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. When you enter a house, first say, 'Shalom.' If someone promotes peace there, your peace will rest on you. Stay there eating and drinking whatever they give you, because the worker deserves his wages." A gospel inspired by God. On the 14th of September in 1964, at age 18, I entered the seminary to begin 8 years of training for priesthood. And it was in the middle of a very long, drawn-out, difficult, but exciting birth. Now, you know very well that a single contraction doesn't birth the baby. It takes many contractions to birth the baby. This particular set of contractions lasted almost 3 years, and it gave birth, finally, to a new version of the church. And the birthing process we call now Vatican II, which went on from 1962 until 1965. So I'm going to the seminary right in the middle of Vatican II, when a lot of changes are beginning to happen, and we're hoping that something new and vibrant will come after 500 years of dogma and infallible popes. And so a lot of things began to change, including liturgy, how we did liturgy, and how we viewed community. And at the end of that period, the old notion of a pyramidical church with an infallible pope at the top, and the curie underneath him, and cardinals underneath that, and then bishops, and then priests, and then laymen, and at the bottom of the pile, lay women, that model would be discarded, and we'd come up with a model of concentric circles. And the old model of a triumphant church, a militant group colonizing, religiously, would give way to the notion of a pilgrim people on safari in the search for the kingdom of God, like all of the other great wisdom traditions of the planet. And hopefully a liturgy that would let go of magical incantation and give birth instead to mystical spirituality. That was the hope for it. But it was a slow birth and many, many contractions. And so I go to the seminary, and Mass is still in Latin, and every priest would say Mass every day. And you needed a congregation of at least one, which is the reason you had an altar boy. You couldn't say Mass on your own. You had to have a congregation of one, and that's why the acolyte was present. And so there was one chapel in the seminary with 18 little altars around in alcoves. And in the early morning, there'd be priests at each of the altars saying Mass in Latin. And there'd have to be an acolyte in attendance. And each guy would be whispering in Latin, the entire Mass. And I remember one morning, I'm assisting Father Francis Hickey. And he was in his 80s at this stage. He was actually one of the founders of our particular congregation, the St. Patrick's Missionary Society. He'd founded it way back in 1932 with 2 other guys. At this stage, he's old and decrepit, he's almost blind, and he's got false teeth that rattle whenever he speaks. And he's starting the Mass, and he gets to the Gospel. And I'm kneeling behind him, and I'm following it in my little missalette in Latin. Now, before you start the Gospel, there's a statement that goes in Latin, Sequentia Sancta Evangelii Secundum, and then you put in the name. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to, in Latin, and then you fill in the name. It could be from Mark, from Luke, from Matthew, or from John. So he starts into the Gospel passage, and he's peering over his glasses, and his teeth are rattling, and he's whispering when he says, Sequentia Sancta Evangelii. Sequentia Sancta Evangelii Secundum. So he has like 6 attempts at it. So I'm reading in mine. So the 5th or 6th attempt, I fill in the blank. And he says, Sequentia Sancta Evangelii Secundum. And I say, Ioannum. He turns around and says, Mister, is it you or me who's saying Mass? So I got my comeuppance. So very, very slowly, the Mass began to change. And at some stage, some parts were in English or in the vernacular, and then later, the whole thing was changed. But it was a very, very slow birth. And what was even slower was the notion of community. What kind of a community this church represented, the Catholic Church in toto, what kind of a community it represented. And that's what I want to address this morning. I want to talk about, how communities are built and how communities are supported, how we live in vibrant communities. Now, when I was thinking about this morning, for some strange reason, I had an image of a Rubik cube. I don't know how many of you played with Rubik cubes? Okay, you all did, okay. So if you examine a Rubik cube, it's basically 3 axes. And there are 3 levels to it. And on each level, there are 3 rows and 3 columns. So it literally is a 3 by 3 by 3 matrix. So there are 27 different components to it. And there are 54 faces to it. There are 4 sides in the bottom and in the top. And there are typically 6 colors. There's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and white. They're the typical colors of it. And for some reason, this came into my mind that this would be a great image to talk about community, how we build and form and maintain community. And so the 3 levels, in some senses, would be, on one level, you have Kujitegemea, Kujitumikia, and Kujitumikia. And I'll explain those terms in a few minutes. The second level has to do with time, treasure, and talent. And the third level has to do with local communities, a global community, and a cosmic community. And so they interpenetrate each other. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to make 9 main points, I'm just going to make 6 main points. So here they are. The first one is Kujitegemea. The second one is Kujitumikia. The third one is Kujitumikia. The fourth one is building local community. The fifth is building global communities. And the sixth is building a cosmic community. So let me start with Kujitegemea. In my time in Kenya, 14 years in Kenya, in remote areas where I had the privilege of kind of starting from the ground up. And these were the first 3 points I'm going to make, were the 3 principles which I was trying to use to formulate community. And the first one is Kujitegemea, self-reliance. The idea was that every community became self-reliant as quickly as possible. Sometimes to get it started, you needed to bring resources in from the outside, sometimes cash resources, in order to get a community going. But the idea was that very, very, very quickly, every community would be self-reliant. That whatever the needs of the community were, they were going to be met by the community itself. And so it was very, very important that you didn't just make, freeloaders out of any community, that people became self-reliant as communities very, very quickly. So they contributed what they could contribute. And there wasn't a lot of cash in the area, very, very obviously. But people would, they'd bring eggs during the offertory procession. You get eggs up there, or you get corn cobs up there. Occasionally you get a chicken. It was a big feast day and somebody was feeling really, really flush. You might get a goat. And so these were the offerings, but they were trying to, support their church. And very often, we would try to turn these resources into a cash value if we were trying to build a church or a hospital or something. So there was a system called harambe, self-help, where you would auction off stuff like this to try to convert it into cash so you could buy cement or roofing material or whatever. But the idea was that very, very quickly, you tried to get people to be self-supporting. You didn't want them dependent on outside. So that was the first principle of building community, that every community had to become self-reliant as quickly as possible. The second point then was we call it Kujitumikia, self-ministering, that whatever the needs of the community were, people within the community needed to be able to address those kinds of needs. And so this leads to the notion of what is ministry really? Very often we've been taught to think that ministry is something that, higher up appoints, that a priest is ordained by a bishop or a bishop is appointed by a pope or whatever, and that ministries have to do with some dude at the top commissioning somebody lower down to fulfill some kind of liturgical function. That is not what ministry is about. The definition of ministry is this, as far as I'm concerned. Ministry has 4 facets to it. There is a need in the community. There's a volunteer who is willing to address that particular need, whatever the need is. There is training given to that person if they don't have the necessary ability right off the bat. And then there's a commissioning by the community for that person to act in that capacity on their behalf. And it doesn't matter what the need is. If there's a need in a community for a priest, I am totally convinced if there's a volunteer in the group and he's given the training to do it, or she's given the training to do it, and is then commissioned by the community to act in that capacity on their behalf, that is a priest. If there's a need for a social worker, for outreach, there's a need in the community, somebody volunteers, I'll do that. If training is necessary, they're given the training, and then they're commissioned by the community to act in that fashion on their behalf. So that's the essence of ministry. Ministry is not the appointment of somebody, by some dude higher up the chain and saying, you're in charge of X, or I'm ordaining you to be Y. It's a community need, a volunteer, training, and a commissioning. And when you look at how the early Christian community dealt with this, you see exactly what happens. So the young community, after Jesus is gone, is casting about, what are we going to do now? How do we survive as a community? And they began to identify what the needs were. And basically, there were three kinds of needs became obvious very, very quickly. There were pedagogical needs for teachings. There were liturgical needs because they were celebrating together rites. And then there were social needs because there were people with orderly, they needed food and bread and healing. And so you see very, very quickly, these ministries begin to evolve. So the first group is the kind of the pedagogy. And here you have the 12 apostles who are the teachers, and their job is to pass on the good news. Or the 72 that we read about today. Or the women that were part of this group. There were both men and women who were sent out as apostles. So their job was to spread this good news. So this was about pedagogy. The first need was people wanted to know who was this character and what was his message. And so there were people who sent out to address that need by teaching who he was and what he said. Very, very quickly, there's a whole other group of needs begin to manifest. This community now, as well as being very, very observant Jews, and they all were very observant Jews who went to temple on a regular basis, they were also meeting on their own for liturgical celebrations that they called Eucharistia, Thanksgiving. And so there were liturgical needs that began to manifest very, very quickly. And so there's the appointment of what were then called bishops. So the bishop initially was a presider over the Eucharist. That was his function. He was not an administrator. He was not some kind of a civil servant functionary. He was the person who presided over the Eucharist. And then at some stage, when the liturgy became a little bit more complex, there were assistants to the bishop. And these guys were called priests. So the priests were assistants to the bishops. Then, as well as that, you had, when liturgy got going, you had other kinds of needs. So you had need for people, for instance, to read. Not everybody was literate at that stage. So you had to pick out people who were able to read. And very often, there would be letters coming from other communities in other parts of the world, and they wanted somebody who could read these letters. And somebody, obviously, who could read the Hebrew scriptures, was conversant with Hebrew. And so you needed a whole bunch of people to answer that need, who can read Hebrew. And if there's letters coming from the Greek-speaking world or from the Roman-speaking world, who can read Latin or who can read Greek. So there's a whole ministry grows up of the readers that were called the lectors. And then there's a group called the porters. At some stage, these young communities are being persecuted. They're afraid of their lives. And so wherever they're meeting and holding their Eucharistic sacrifices, the doors are locked. And there's one guy guarding the door. And if somebody comes to the door, he wants to make sure, is this a Roman soldier, or is this one of our community? And so he's got to check before he lets anybody in. And that became a new ministry. You call him a security guard if you want, but in the Latin, he's called the porter. That became a ministry. And then they become, when it got more and more complex, the liturgy did, the bishop is presiding, the priest is assisting, and then there's an acolyte, somebody else who's helping out. So the ministries begin to evolve. And then at some stage they realize there aren't just pedagogical needs and there aren't just liturgical needs, there are social needs. There are widows and orphans among them. Who's going to look out for those? And so the apostles have a meeting and they say, that's not our function. Our function is to teach. So we're going to create a whole new ministry. And they called it diaconia or the diaconate. And these literally are social workers. Their job is to go out and find out, who has physical needs, food needs in the community, and help those. And when that got more complex, there were assistants given to them, and they're called subdeacons. So this was another ministry. And then obviously there are people sick in the community, and so there's a new ministry created which is called exorcist. Now we think of exorcist as somebody who throws out demons or casts out demons. But in the thinking of the time, all illnesses are the result of some kind of demonic activity. So that was the old model of illness, that no matter what illness you had, whether it was leprosy or any kind of condition, some kind of demonic forces were responsible for this imbalance in the system. Now, we've changed our models, not necessarily for the better. At one stage, we think that all illnesses are just bacterial, that they're the result of microorganisms. That's a theory of illness. It's not a particularly holistic theory, or not a complete theory, but a lot of medicine subscribes to that. Or there's a theory that illnesses are all biochemical imbalances. And now there's a theory that illnesses, have to be addressed holistically. So the model of what illness constituted has changed a lot. But in that time, the model was that all illness was caused by some kind of demonic activity. So the exorcist was not somebody just who was casting out demons, he was the healer. So this was a ministry. So you see in the early community that as needs begin to emerge in the community, they create responses to that. And the responses we would call ministries. Now, the unfortunate thing was that over the course of Christian history, over the first 1,000-year period, they began to telescope all of these ministries, and the priests began to take over all of these functions. And so at one stage, they just become stages in the development in the way to priesthood. So in the 8 years that I was in the seminary, sequentially, you were inducted into each of these. At some stage, you were given the ministry of acolyte. Later, you were porter. Then you were lector. Then you were exorcist, then you were subdeacon, then you were deacon, and finally after 8 years, you were made a priest. So they had amalgamated and pulled in all these ministries and just made them symbolic ministries on the road to priesthood. So they had shrunken down and totally misunderstood what these ministries were about. Now, in the late Middle Ages, particularly with monasticism looked in the world around it and began to respond to different kinds of needs, particularly agricultural needs. It was the monasteries who saved or gave agriculture to Europe in the Middle Ages. They were the great farmers, and they developed technologies and finally even breeding technologies with plants and animals, and they gave this back to the world. They were the great educators. The monasteries were the great educators. They were the people who started the great universities of Europe in the 13th and 14th and 15th century. So they, in some senses, they saved education, third level education. They protected arts, whether it was stained glass or calligraphy. These were the ones who protected and gave art. So they're responding to needs in the Dark Ages by protecting the treasure trove. And later on, in the 18th, 19th century, you would get other needs and other groups trying to respond to these needs. So you got, for instance, the great teaching orders, who realized that most children were illiterate and uneducated. If you weren't from a rich family, you couldn't go to school. And so a whole bunch of people like the Christian Brothers or the Sisters of Charity or the Sisters of Mercy, they began to found school systems so that ordinary people could be educated. And they began to respond to the illnesses in the world by creating hospital systems or nursing orders whose function literally was to go and respond to the needs of the community. So again and again and again throughout history, you find that when there's a real need in the community, some soul is going to respond, with a ministry which is appropriate to the need. So right down to our own modern times. Unfortunately, it seems to me that mostly the churches have gotten out of the business of responding to the real current needs, and they're focused on old kind of stuff, because the needs now are changing fairly dramatically. So the great ministries in our time, in my opinion, are stuff like hospice movements, where we're making the dying process, again, something, a spiritual exit, rather than people surrounded by machinery in hospitals. They're responding, for instance, to the sickness of the planet itself with great ecological movements. So a modern ministry for me is the whole ecological movement, where our mother, ourself, has the need to be healed and to be preserved and to be made whole again. And this is a huge ministry, maybe the most important ministry we could indulge in. And part of that is the recognition of stuff like animal rights, the realization that we share the banquet of God's largesse, not just with other human beings, but with all life form on the planet. And therefore all these beings have to have rights also. That is a ministry, it seems to me, that's been really important. And I come right down then to our own little community here, Companions on the Journey. We're 15 or 16 years old at this stage. And again, I see that we have tried to do the same thing. We are trying to respond to needs in this community and in the wider community, and they're the same kinds of needs. There are pedagogical needs, and so how do you send out a message of hope to our world? And we're trying to do it in our own kind of fashion through websites and podcasts and books and study groups and stuff like that. We're trying to respond to that in our own little fashion. And we're responding to the liturgical needs of the group. So, before most of us come here in the morning, somebody has opened up this church and prepared it. Sacristans have prepared the altar. The choir is up here getting ready. People are ready to read the scriptures for us. People will clean up afterwards. People will feed us outside when we're finished. So there's a whole group of people in the community who are on a weekly basis responding to the needs of the group. And that's what keeps the community healthy and vibrant. There are people here who are responding to the needs of the wider community. And so people who are involved in feeding the hungry programs or the food closet or the clothes closet, places like that. So we're attempting to try to reach out to the needs of the larger community. And so that's what Kujitumikia looks like. That's what ministering to the self looks like. That we have to recognize what are the needs in our community, in the immediate community, in the wider community, and in the global community, and how do we address those kinds of needs. So that's the second point. Third one then, in Swahili it's called Kujitengemea. And Kujitengemea means self-propagation or self-replication in some senses. In other words, spreading the good news in some fashion. Now it's interesting that the technical definition of life, according to biology, is that something is a life form if it can do two things. If it can feed itself and if it can reproduce itself. That's the official technical definition of life. Anything which can't both reproduce itself and feed itself is regarded as inorganic. But whatever can reproduce itself, and feed itself, that as a species is a live form. And so here we find this in community again. A live human community is one which is self-propagating. Not in the sense of proselytizing, but in the sense of that if you're doing something really good, something that's really, really working, it's going to spread. It's going to be infectious. People are going to notice. So it's an amazing thing to go into a culture which has never heard a particular piece of good news, and to be the first person in to be able to share that with a group. Now, every one of us likes to be the first with a piece of news. Unfortunately, sometimes it's gossip, and we want to, tell them, do you hear about such and such a person? But mostly, we love to share good news. We love to be the first person to be able to tell you, did you hear that? And then you tell them the good news. So we all love to be the first person to tell you good news. What would it be like, do you think, if you went into a community in a totally foreign place and you have a life experience which is, as far as you're concerned, is mystical, and it makes you thrive and glow and be filled with passion for living. And you get the opportunity to share that kind of experience with a community who has never heard that. What would you share with them from your life experience? What is it that you'd want to report? And how would you go about doing it? Would you impose it upon them? Would you try to browbeat them, with this? This is the real truth here. How would you go about, sharing that experience, which is so core to your being and sets you alive so much? How would you go about sharing that information with somebody, with another group, an entire culture? How would you go about doing it? And what would you share? What in your heart is important that you bring to other people? Now, I had the privilege of doing that in several communities in East Africa. Now, some communities were already contaminated, and I use that word advisedly, that there are some versions of religion which have immunized people against real spirituality, that the version that has come in has been so, anti-life. You can't drink, or you can't dance, or you can't sing. These are demonic kinds of activities. That there are some communities which have already been contaminated and immunized against real spirituality. But supposing you find a community that hasn't been immunized, and you're the first person in there, and you want to share something that really, really makes you feel alive and loving and connected to Source, what would it be that you would share with them? And how would you go about sharing it? Well, I had that privilege a few times in a few different communities, in very remote areas on equatorial Kenya. And my approach was to try to become what Carl Jung called a Gnostic intermediary. There's a very big difference between a crusader, somebody who comes in and proselytizes and imposes a system on somebody else, whether it's an economic model, or a medical system, or an educational system, or a spiritual system. A crusader is somebody who comes in and imposes a paradigm on an unsuspecting community. A Gnostic intermediary, as Carl Jung defined it, is somebody who is fluent in two cultures, totally well-versed in the culture of origin, and becomes totally au fait with another culture, and then cross-fertilizes the two. So it's not about just giving them the good news, it's about listening to what their good news is, and finding some kind of a synthesis between the two. And so what that looked like for me was steeping myself in a language, learning the language really, really well, becoming really conversant with the culture, learning the history, a fascination with folklore and with proverbs, and on the basis of that, then sharing my own proverbs, my own folklore, my own passion, and hoping that from that synthesis, that something really exciting and better than any of the two would begin to emerge. And so, for me, that's what Kujitegemea looks like. It is not about crusaders going out to impose their viewpoint on an unsuspecting, innocent, naive culture. It's about, civilizations sharing insights and experiences with each other, so that something truly great can begin to emerge from this meeting. So that's my third point. The fourth point then is, as you start building communities, there's 3 levels to how this operates. And the first level is the local community. There has to be face-to-face community. And the difficulty for us right now is that so many communities are being formed in cyberspace, which is good, but it is no substitute for face-to-face encounters. Tweeting, or texting, or even phoning or emailing is no substitute for hands-on human encounters. They may be a supplement to it, but they're not a substitute for it. So we need vibrant, hands-on kinds of communities. And in these communities, again, we have to be able to answer all of our needs and supply whatever the needs are. Whether there's time, whether it's talent, or whether it's our treasure, or finances, or energies, or time, whatever it is, to be able to contribute all of these. And so, the old statement, if you travel on an airplane, you're told in the event of a sudden loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will fall from the ceiling. Make sure you put your own on before you attempt to help anybody else. That's true in community as well. We're of no use to the global community unless we come from vibrant local communities. And so there's 2 ways of putting on your oxygen mask in a plane. You can put it on in order to survive, and to hell with you, Jack, or you can put it on in order to survive and be of help to somebody else. It's the same thing with community. You can try to build your own community in order to just make sure your needs are met, or you can build your own community in order that it become a vibrant group to reach out and help other communities. And so it becomes really, really important. We're of no use to anybody unless the community itself is vibrant and is meeting all of its own needs. If we can't meet all the needs of our community, whatever they might be, whether they're liturgical, pedagogical, financial, intellectual, social, whatever they are, if we're not meeting those needs, then we're like a dead limb on a tree. And if a community is not vibrant, 2 things begin to happen. The first thing is that we can't meet our own needs, and therefore we can't meet the needs of others outside us, and eventually we actually become a drag in the entire system. Not only are we not helping others, we're a drag on their resources as we kind of implode ourselves. So there can be no global community, successful global community. There can be no outreach. There can be no social work unless the community itself is alive and vibrant and meeting its own needs. So that's the basis of it. That we have to become a really vibrant, self-sustaining, self-ministering community who then has the resources and the energy and the strength and the focus and the passion to reach out and help the communities around us and finally help the global community. This brings me to my 5th point. What does the global community look like at this stage? More and more and more as we move through history, we begin to realize that barriers and boundaries are artificial. How ridiculous would it be if, when you were coming from Mountain View this morning, Kathleen, to Palo Alto, that somewhere between San Antonio, around San Antonio and El Camino, that you met an immigration booth and you were stopped by some guy with a gun and a hat and wanted to see, why are you coming to Palo Alto? We would think it's ludicrous that there would be immigration booths separating 2 cities on the peninsula. We would even think it would be ridiculous if on the county boundaries between Santa Clara and San Mateo counties that there were policemen checking people. What business have you coming into Santa Clara County? What are you doing here? We would think it totally ridiculous. We would even think it was ridiculous if there were immigration people between California and Nevada, and that as you're driving across, you're stopped, and you're told, why are you coming to Nevada? What business have you got in Nevada? Is it a California license? We would think it totally ludicrous. I guarantee you, in not too many years down the road, we will think it equally ridiculous that somebody coming from Mexico into the United States or from Canada into the United States is going to be stopped at a border and find, what are you doing in the United States of America? What are you doing here? Or that somebody coming from the Organization of African Union, is trying to get into Europe, is going to be stopped by an EU policeman and said, what are you doing in the European Union? You belong to the Organization of African Nations. It will be totally ridiculous. It's so simple for us. You take any sky shot, there are no boundaries on the planet. And so the global community is the recognition that all of these boundaries and all of these barriers are anachronistic at this stage. They need to be dissolved. I don't say we can just say with an act of parliament they're gone in the morning. But there needs to be some real thinking that lets go of these boundaries, because they're as anachronistic as a Mountain View, Palo Alto immigration booth would have been. So the global community is going to look like the dissolution of all of these kind of artificial boundaries between us. So we regard ourselves as a global community. But I would extend that even beyond the human family. We're not just 7 billion human beings, part of one species, who have a right to planet Earth. We're part of millions of species that have a right to planet Earth. And that therefore the global community consists not just of human beings who've resolved their differences, but human beings who've recognized the rights of all the other species with whom we share this planet. And then truly we become a global community. That's what it looks like. And the final point then is, what does the cosmic community consist of? When you look at the extraordinary wonder of this universe, you come to the realization very, very quickly that this particular universe is just one among many. According to quantum mechanical theory, there are 10 to the power of 27 brand new universes created every second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. That is a mind-boggling number. That's how many universes are being brought into being every second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. Now, some of them are mathematical duds. They just fizzle out. But even if the tiniest percentage of these exist, then we live in a pluriformity of universes. And in fact, the universes themselves reincarnate. This universe that we've inhabited, which is now 13.7 billion years of age, this was not the original universe. This is a daughter universe to a mother universe. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When this little baby made its first mistake, and it made its first mistake within nanoseconds of being born, it looked like it was going to die. Mother universe intervened immediately. Within nanoseconds of the Big Bang, it was producing particles of matter and antimatter in equal measure. And when matter and antimatter meet each other, they annihilate each other, and there's only energy left. So it looked like the little baby was going to be stillborn, or at least just last a few seconds. Mother made a change. And for every million particles of antimatter, she created 1,000,001 extra particle of matter. And from that tiny little readjustment, this entire universe of 150 billion galaxies was born. And so Mother knew how to resolve the crisis for the neonate. So we live in a universe which is maybe the great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of an original universe. And in parallel existences, all happening at the same time. And so we need to embrace that and attempt to become citizens of that realization. But we're not going to be allowed, to exit planet Earth and export our craziness and our greed and our warfare out even into the solar system, but certainly not outside the solar system. Some greater forces, some much more advanced civilizations than ours are watching us and have been watching us from the beginning of this experiment of Homo sapiens sapiens on planet Earth. And particularly since we developed atomic and nuclear weaponry, they've been really monitoring us. And there are lots of reports again and again and again of extraterrestrial craft visiting nuclear facilities and literally shutting down ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. There's no way they're going to allow us to export our craziness out into the solar system, or certainly not beyond our solar system. So in order to become cosmic citizens, we firstly have to become global citizens. And when we finally get our act together, and when finally we recognize that there are no differences between us as human beings, and that there aren't even significant differences between us of various species on the planet, then, and only then, are we ready for cosmic citizenship. Okay, guys. So let's open it up to questions. Okay. We get it.
So I grew up in a large family community, and it's very easy to lose yourself in that as well. I'm a twin, so I get that.
Double whammy.
Yeah. I get that the community is there to support and nurture others within the community, but at some point we also have to be individually responsible for our beingness and what we produce. Mm-hmm. There's times when we're sick, and so we need the giving and the taking and that type of thing. But there's also times when people just rely on that, and they subsist on, they exist on other people's constant giving. So there's that drain of the resources. How do you have conversations about staying as independent as long as you can, still creating opportunities for people to give and teach and learn? But to me, there's a lot going on with individual accountability. We've moved to a very much an entitled society in certain sectors versus the endowing. And I'd love to hear more about that.
Brilliant, great question. So the image that comes to mind when I hear you ask this question is the image of, a vibrant organism, whatever the organism is. Take a human body, so human body. A fully human body consists of fully healthy organs. So the heart has to be working well, the lungs working well, the kidneys, whatever. And so your entire body is healthy when all the organs are healthy. And the organs are healthy when every constituent cell in the organ is healthy. So the human being consists of about 50 trillion cells. Now, the interesting thing is, when you go back 3.7 billion years, there were only single-cell creatures on planet Earth. And each of these single-cell creatures was totally self-sufficient. And right today, every single one of your 50 trillion cells is self-sufficient. It has an immune system, it has an endocrine system, it has a respiration system, it has an elimination system, every single cell in your body. But at some stage, they began to amalgamate because they realized that there is more benefit to the individual by becoming part of a community than by remaining separate. So they didn't forfeit their individuality, they merely amalgamated into more intelligent, groupings. And so when you amalgamate into different groupings, then there's some kind of allocation of role. And so in this particular space, sort of 50 trillion cells, some of them have specialized as kidney cells, some as saliva, some as eye cells, some as brain cells, whatever, and they're all doing functions for each other. Every single one of them needs to be healthy in order to be a contributing member. And when they get unhealthy, or when a group of them goes into rebellion, we call that cancer. So when a group of cells decides to declare independence from the organ or from the organism, we get big troubles. But the organism never suppresses the individual cells any more than it suppresses the individual organs. You cannot have a healthy body, peopled by unhealthy organs, nor can you have a healthy organ peopled by unhealthy cells. So the vitality and the vibrancy of the individual cells is the key to a healthy organ, and healthy organs are the key to a healthy organism. So that's true, it seems to me, of the sentient community in our entire universe. That there are levels of cooperation, and there are levels of community all the ways up the chain. Beginning with, the community of the entire human family, then the community of all species on planet Earth, then the community of all life within our galaxy, then all life within our universe. And so for each of the cells, there has to be this trade-off between a little bit of dependence on the organ, because now that we've specialized, each cell is going to be dependent upon others for some particular kinds of functions. So there's a symbiosis that's happening in the very same way you see in nature. I just read this brilliant article yesterday about a Canadian woman who's a forest scientist, and she's looking at this subculture. And what she's found out is that, the root systems of trees, make an agreement with fungi. How do you pronounce that? Fungi or fungi? Fungi. How does it, George? Fungi, okay. Make an agreement with fungi. They trade carbon, which is got through photosynthesis, with the fungi, which have no access to sunlight, but they're trading nitrogen. But moreover, there's a network, there's an underground network, an intelligent system, whereby if one tree or one organism is impacted by a disease, the message is carried through the root systems, and it can spread for miles and miles and miles in the ecosystem, so that other trees of the same species can develop, a response, an immune response to this particular illness. And so when we do, for instance, this forestering where we cut down just swathes of trees, we interrupt that communication system. And so the system itself is impacted. So there are some things that individual kinds of cells can provide for themselves and some things they can't. But because we live in communities, that interdependency means that everybody, even those who are specializing, can get all their needs met. But if any system decides it's not going to contribute anymore, but it's going to keep taking, then the organism is going to suffer. So at some stage, that system needs to be rehabilitated, or it needs to be, cut off in some way. And so we'll do that with the human body. Sometimes the only way to deal with the cancer is literally surgically remove it. Sometimes we can address it through biochemistry. Sometimes we can rehabilitate it through, meditation. And so the first effort is always to try to rehabilitate the individual who's not cooperating. And ultimately, when that doesn't work at all, the community has the right to protect itself against that kind of depredation. And that for me is true all the way up and all the way down. Yes.
Between the two.
Yeah. They're both part of it. They're two sides of the same coin, and nobody is there to be helped only, or nobody is there to help only. All of us, experience both sides. Now, there are times in our life when there is more need for help than the ability to give it, but that should be a temporary condition, normally. And so when a person is restored to full health, then they're equal members of the community. But if we're not giving the same amount, we're giving according to our native ability. Yeah, but it's always a balancing act. Just like there's no such thing, as I'm concerned, between teachers and students, as if there's one person with all the knowledge and the others are empty vessels getting filled up. Any decent teacher will tell you that teaching is a two-way street, that a good teacher is learning as much from her pupils, as she's giving to them. Lorraine and then Karen.
How cosmic community,
Okay.
when we die physically,
Yes.
and we still continue a transcendent relationship with our ancestors,
Yes.
it seems that the planes of existence, non-physical existence, that a lot of our ancestors still stay connected to us.
Absolutely.
In
Absolutely.
the physical realm.
Absolutely.
So I don't understand.
So the thing is that reality does not consist of just a physical plane. According to the Hindu model, there are 7 levels to reality. I think there are many more. There's a physical level, there's an etheric level, there's an astral level, there's a mental level, there's a causal level, there's an individual soul level, and then there's cosmic consciousness. So there are all these levels and dimensions. I think there are many more. That's a simple model, a 7-tier model. And so no being, no entity ever ceases to exist any more than you can destroy matter. You can't change matter, you can't destroy matter. You can change its state. You can change it from a liquid to a solid, to a gas, to a plasma, but you can't make it not exist anymore. And the same thing is true of any being, including a human being. Death is not the end of the entity. Death is the shuffling off of the mortal coil, so that you identify more with a non-physical condition. So all of these ancestors of ours are as vitally involved in our affairs, as Karen and you are involved, sitting beside each other. And so the Catholic Church, in fairness, got this piece right. They talked about the communion of the saints. They talked about the church on earth, the church in purgatory, and the church in heaven. Now, the terminology is pathetic, but the idea is good. The realization is that, all communities are interconnected. Once a connection has been established, they can never be unestablished. And we know this even in quantum mechanics. There was a very famous Irish physicist in the 1960s called John Bell, who came up with what was probably the second most important formula of the 20th century. It's called Bell's theorem. And it's the realization of the entanglement at even a subatomic level. Once you interfere, with a subatomic particle that's paired to another, they're paired forever, no matter how far they're apart. And so his theory says that the entire universe itself, the physical universe he's just talking about, is entangled. And it is true at the other levels. Everything is entangled, not in the sense of just kind of all messed up together, but all in relationship with each other. So whether we have physical bodies or we're in the dimension of pure spirit, the connections are no less weak or no less strong. So we're part of a cosmic community in all dimensions and at all levels. And so I believe that part of the evolution, when you go from local to global to cosmic, the next jump is dimensional. That you're not just stuck in a physical universe, but that you've jumped dimensions and you're now aware of a community existing at other dimensions. And now you become part of that community. Yeah. Karen.
So this is a little bit of a follow-up on Lisa's, and it has to do with the sense of really the extraordinary beauty of true community, where you have this kind of the beauty and the wonder at the same time, because you have so many people with extraordinary gifts. Everybody has something, but they are all very different, and that common ground that they find because they have a sense of shared purpose. And so my question is, to some extent, about almost like a responsibility that each person has to bring forth what it is that they can to enrich kind of the tapestry of community.
Absolutely. So, for instance, on Sunday, the 8th of September, the second Sunday each month, we have a children's mass. And on the 8th of September, that mass is actually going to be up in my house up in Healdsburg. And so we've invited all the kids and their parents and grandparents to come and celebrate up there. But Margie Galdes is organising the food for that, and it's a potluck. And so she's put up sign lists for people, who's going to bring, lettuce and who's going to bring tomatoes and who's going to bring bread or whatever. Now, suppose we've created a list which ensures that everybody will be fed. But 2 or 3 people decide, yeah, I don't have to bring anything, people will never notice. And everybody's thinking the same thing. And we arrive up there, and there's like 25 voracious kids and, grandparents and parents, and there's no food there. Uh-oh, what happened here? Because somebody, didn't, honor their commitment. So when we don't honor our commitments, then communities break down. But I believe that, I said this to you many, many times, that we're not here by happenstance, that every human being on planet Earth is here because we have made preconception contracts with each other. That all of the souls on planet Earth right now agreed to be on this planet at this time and to form a global community. And each of us was going to bring particular kinds of gifts and particular kinds of needs, because there's a complementarity between needs and gifts. You can't exercise a gift in the absence of a need, and a need in the absence of a gift is frustrating. And so each of us comes down with both needs and gifts, but they're complementary needs and complementary gifts. So everybody on the planet came down with something to contribute to the planet. And that's the beauty of community. When people understand what they've come to contribute, and they contribute it, then the needs get fulfilled. When people only come down with needs, think they only have needs and have nothing to contribute, the whole system implodes. So it's a question of, understanding, what have I come to do on planet Earth? What gifts have I brought? My gifts do not belong to me. I've used this image many, many times. We come down with 2 kinds of gifts. The first one is our talents, and they don't belong to us. Our talents do not belong to us. I'm like a mailman with a bag of letters. Because the bag is mine, I think the letters are mine as well. They're not. The letters belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. My job is to deliver them. But mostly we hog them, we think they belong to us. Now we're allowed to make a living from it. The postman is entitled to get his salary for delivering the letters, but he's not allowed to hog them. And the other kind of gifts we come down with are our problems, because the problems are the guarantee that we're going to have to stretch and grow in life, that we're not just going to sit on our duff. And they're complementary. The talents and the needs are complementary. So we come down, we have to share what we've come with. We did not get these gifts to hoard them. We got these gifts to share them. Mike.
First, well, actually, I know the reason. About a year or so ago, maybe less, I decided to overcome my own sense of isolation, which all human beings feel if they reflect a minute. So I decided what I would do is not have contacts during the day, but connections.
Brilliant.
And I'll just give you an example of one that happened about a week ago. And these are very recurring now that I started doing it. Well, I'll add one other thing. I was in Las Vegas over the weekend, And I had one of the most intense spiritual conversations I ever had with anybody, sitting outside smoking a cigar and drinking bourbon in Las Vegas. The guy's a mystic.
Okay.
Travels the world taking photographs for glamorous magazines. But I said, what makes you do that? He says, the Holy Spirit. And I said, we've had too much bourbon. And then he explained it to me, but that's not the story I want to tell. So I was in the pet store a couple of weeks ago and checking out some food for my cats, and I mentioned how I am a reconverted anti-animal pet person, and now I'm so into these pets. And he said, he was an older man, and he said, you know, I was the same way. I had to be in his 50s or 60s, and he said, I had a dog. I had a little poodle, and it died a couple of weeks ago. And he started to cry. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what we're really connecting with here is not, it's a connection. And it's a connection with the deepest part of humanity. Mm-hmm. It's a connection with love. Totally. And it's his dog that died, it's whatever. Mm-hmm. And I found making contacts into connections a fascinating thing. I have had the most incredible conversations with the oddest, not odd, but people want to touch their humanity. They want to tell you about their poodle who died and share that.
Brilliant, Mike. Thanks a million.
So it's my cosmic connection.
That's brilliant.
With the guy in the store.
Because you're touching the divine in the dog or the cat or whatever.
You touch the deepest, and it's there, and it's simple, and it's usually fun.
Yeah, brilliant. Lisa, and then Christine.
Thank you. During your homily, you made a comment about us being observed by perhaps more evolved beings, and that they're watching what we're doing, particularly on a military basis. What are you speaking about?
I'm talking about, different traditions will use different terminology. So if you come from a kind of a Judeo-Christian Islamic world, you may call these angelic beings, that there are some kinds of interdimensional beings who don't have full physicality, but who are really, watching over. We call them guardian angels. And they're individuals, guardians for individual people. They're guardians for particular nations or cultures or whatever. So there's some kind of evolved, loving, compassionate entities, higher level than us, who are actually, watching over us. If you come from a different tradition, you would call these extraterrestrials. And indeed they are, because they're not living on planet Earth. So by definition, any entity which is not living on planet Earth and visits is an extraterrestrial. And so you can say that there are people coming in spaceships, or there are people jumping dimensions, or there are people who are time travelers. But there's millions of cases, on record now of craft appearing over military installations and shutting down, the control systems remotely of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it's happening all over our country, it's happening all over the world. That these guys are actually shutting down these, they reactivate when they're gone, but they're demonstrating that they can do that. If you want to check it out on YouTube, there's this great video by a guy called Dr. Jacobs. He was a photographer with the American Air Force, and his job was, when they were launching intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, he was to photograph them in transit. So they're launching them from whatever they're launching. He's in California watching the trajectory and photographing it. And he's photographing this particular shoot. Now, they're dummy warheads, but they look like the original thing. It's a dummy warhead. There's no nuclear device on it, but it's built to carry a nuclear device. And he's photographing it. And he brings it down next day to base, and his commander is going through it, and he calls me and he says, "Are you playing jokes on me?" And Jacob says, "How do you mean playing jokes with you?" He says, "Did you kind of Photoshop," or whatever the term would have been? This was in the 1970s. He said, "I want you to look at this video." And in the video, as this missile is taken off and reaching height of about 30,000 feet, some kind of a craft came up behind it, shot a ray at the nose cone, which would have been the nuclear warhead, sped up in front of it, came around in front of it, shot another beam at it, came down underneath it, shot it a third time, and went above it and shot it again, and just knocked the nose cone off and then disappeared. So they just totally, disarmed this nuclear warhead. So this is happening again and again and again and again. So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of this. So somebody is watching out for us and is making sure that if at least they can't stop us killing each other on planet Earth, there's no way you're going to export that crap and start doing it, intercosmically. So, sorry, Chris was next. You want to pass to Jane? Okay, Jane.
One of the things that I've always heard is that because of free will and because we sort of, quote unquote, control our own destiny, the beings that watch over us don't intervene unless they're invited to intervene.
Yes.
You want to comment on
Yes,
that?
I agree with you. It's, I believe in Star Trek. I've never seen Star Trek, but I believe there was, it's called the Prime Directive, that you're not allowed to intervene unless you're invited in. How long have you been praying to your guardian angel? How many hundreds of years have people been praying for divine intervention? They're being invited in, and they have been invited in for a long, 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 long time. They're not going to come in and demonstrate, tremendous power and suppress anybody, but there's a way of moving in the human heart. And so these beings, whether you call them angelic beings or you call them extraterrestrials, a lot of people have been invited. I've personally been inviting them in for the last 12 or 13 years. Before I sleep every night, I say, I'm volunteering to be available to any light being who wants to try to use me to become an influence for planet Earth. So I'm here, insofar as I'm useful to any of these light beings, I'm here. And so it's like an offering of resources for it. So people have been inviting these beings in as long as they've been praying to angels. Yeah. So Caitlin was trying to get in a long time. Great. Welcome, Caitlin. Good.
So I've recently had an awakening of this sort of cosmic consciousness that you're speaking of. And it came at me hard and fast this summer. And it's caused a lot of interpersonal and familial challenges. So I'm still trying to integrate everything that has happened this summer. But I suppose I'm curious to hear what it is that you know about the unions between these light beings, because it is my understanding that we are all beings of light here in spacesuits. I think I learned that from you. And that there are real humans here who are intended to unify with other humans for larger purposes that we don't fully understand. So perhaps you could speak to that.
Sure, great point, Caitlin. Thanks a million, Levine. So, there are people opening up and awakening all over the world and all over the universe. So it then becomes a dance, because none of us is infallible. None of us is, the only source of what is. And so we have to try to constantly cross-fertilize our experiences, with other people, with other wisdom traditions. And we have to make sure particularly that, I'm not on an ego trip, and that what's happening to me is not just, wishful thinking, but that I'm grounding it, in my ability to live in planet Earth. So we're spirits in spacesuits, and we have to honor both components. We have to honor the spirit because it's the core essence of us, but we have volunteered for incarnation, which means that we have to celebrate these bodies, we have to honor them, and we have to use them as resources. And we're also members of a team, and no individual comes down on their own to be, a world savior. There are no world saviors anymore. There are communities of enlightened beings creating networks that are changing from the bottom up. But none of us, is the Messiah for everybody else. So we have to try to make sure that we're focusing on the mission rather than on the attendant, what Hinduism would call the siddhis, the gifts. The gifts are not important, whether it's ability to, heal, speak in tongues, bilocate, whatever they might be. They're not important. They're not even indicators of holiness. They're just, corollaries to the journey. So you have to be really, really careful not to get, sucked in and seduced by these kinds of things. And so it's very important that we ground our insights with the community of wisdom of which we're a part, so that we're here as team members and that we're operating as a team, and that none of us is, pretending to be, the Messiah. Yeah. Chris.
I just wanted to piggyback what Mike said. I used to do that with New York taxi cab drivers, and I had some wonderful conversations with some folks in New York City.
You took them home and fed them?
No, I didn't. Or I didn't smoke cigars and drink bourbon with them either. But I would have conversations with them, and it was really interesting to see what would transpire. But I had an interesting experience in June, and I think that the most important thing that I've learned on my journey is to keep asking questions and to keep being open.
Brilliant.
And the thing that really keeps resonating for me is to say what's next, and then to be open to what comes in. And I had an amazing experience in June, and it happened, while pulling the suitcase out of my closet. I got information, and then it was validated, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, I just could not believe it. But I think that's it, is when you're talking about angels and asking your angels to come in, is that we have that opportunity in every moment of our day is to ask for information and to expect that we'll be provided with information that will help us grow on our journey, and to be open to it and to believe it, even if it's something that's so phenomenally fantastical that you're stunned by it, but it does come through.
Great, Chris. Thanks a million. Jane, and then.
Just to piggyback on what Chris said, I was working with a teacher about a week ago, and during that, I was doing work I'd never done before. And suddenly she said, I can't ground myself anymore, I need to take a break. And in retrospect, it's clear to me that I was going maybe into a little bit of someplace I maybe shouldn't have been going, but I didn't see the signposts, if you will. And so when she left, that really startled me, because she's a very strong teacher. And so I immediately just threw up the prayer. I appeal to all light beings for help. Basically, I was inviting that in. And she was gone maybe about 5 minutes, and when she came back in, she walked in and she kind of went, oh. And so I told her what I'd done, and she just looked at me and she said, it worked. So I think the real, to piggyback on what Chris is saying, we need to ask. They won't stomp us down to barge in to take care of it for us, but we need to pray, we need to ask, we need to open ourselves to the possibility.
That's great. So for me, the image that's coming to mind as you speak is like the image of a tree. A tree can't grow if it's, cut off from its root system. But, a tree does not just consist of its root system. There's a trunk, and there are branches, and there are leaves. And in fact, the leaves are feeding the roots as much as the roots are feeding the leaves. So through photosynthesis, leaves are gathering chlorophyll and feeding down to the root structure. And so you need a root system, you need a trunk system, and you need a branch system reaching towards the sky. And that's true, it seems to me, of our spirituality. That any spirituality which is, not grounded is going to die. And at the same time, if you're really, really grounded, but you're not reaching towards the skies, you may as well not be alive. So it's all these, you got to reach for the sky where you're grounded in the earth. Yeah.
I have just a quick question or a comment. So Rudolf Steiner said that the saddest thing that he's ever seen are the angels waiting around for people to ask for assistance.
Beautiful. Beautiful, Mike. Beautiful. Right here, Mike. Go ahead.
You mentioned the importance of face-to-face contact in developing a vibrant community. And we're talking about multi-dimensions and light beings and connection on so many different levels of entanglement. So I'm wondering, as we step into building the global community, if you can talk a little bit more about the qualities of face-to-face communication that we can bring into that heart connection.
Yes, beautiful question. There's a famous story in the Christian scriptures of, in fact, it was yesterday's gospel, and I spoke about it in St. Mark's, of mothers trying to bring little children to Jesus, and the apostles getting really annoyed and saying, yeah, he's busy, leave him alone and bring little kids to him. And Christ got really annoyed and said, don't prevent the little children from coming to me. It is of such of these that the kingdom belongs. And then he cuddled the babies, and gave them back to their mothers. And so I've often thought about, what was Jesus, recognizing in little children that made them, capable of recognizing the kingdom when the rest of us don't? And it seems there are 5 qualities that he recognized. And the first one is kids' extraordinary awe, the ability to be awe-filled, that everything is a source of wonder to them. So that would be the first quality I would say, that in our interpersonal contacts and intercommunity contacts, is to have a sense of awe at the extraordinary insights of this other community or this other tradition. Instead of pointing out what's weird and wonderful about it, to be filled with awe. Oh my God, what a brilliant insight that is. The second thing he recognized in kids was their passion for asking questions, particularly why questions. Kids will ask how questions, but they're mainly interested in why questions. Because how questions are just about the mechanics of the way things work. Why questions have to do with meaning and value. And kids they'll just keep question after question after question, why is. And it's not an interrogation, or it's not a put down of their parents. It's a genuine inquiry. So that's the second level of communication. Genuine inquiry. Why, do you do this? Or why do you perform this kind of ritual? Or, why do you believe that particular doctrine? And it's not a put down. It's a real effort to try and reach out and find what these are asking about. A third quality that he recognizes in kids, I think, is kids are prejudice-free. You have to teach kids how to be prejudiced. Kids do not come in with prejudice. They don't see any differences. They play with anybody until we educate them, be careful of those, don't hang out with that guy or whatever. And so the ability to accept everybody, for who they really are, which is the soul, that kids relate soul to soul. I'm not saying that there's not egoic stuff going on there as well, but kids recognize each other's souls, and they're relating from that place. So any kid from any culture can be dropped into another culture, into a group of kids, and will insert himself right away and play with them. And so that ability to be prejudice-free. The fourth quality he recognized in them, I think, was kids' extraordinary ability to forgive. No matter how badly kids are treated as little kids, they still love their parents. They still forgive. They still come back. They still want to be hugged. And that's the fourth quality, I would say, of this communication, inter-communities. There is no community on planet Earth that hasn't offended other communities on planet Earth. And there's no community on planet Earth that hasn't been sinned against. And so rather than keeping scores, who did what first, it's the ability to let go and recognize we're all doing what we did because of historical, cultural reasons. And if we continue to keep score, it just becomes a vendetta. So real forgiveness is the fourth piece. And the fifth piece is the extraordinary resilience of kids. Kids, no matter how badly they're deprived or neglected, survive. So you get, for instance, the street kids in Sao Paulo in Brazil, literally hundreds of thousands of kids who've been abandoned at age 3 and 4 and 5, and they form communities. And they're, protecting each other and feeding each other and caring for each other. And, in spite of the adult community just, not just neglecting them, but harassing them on a regular basis. So kids' extraordinary ability to be resilient. That would be the fifth quality, I would say. Communication we have to be resilient and not give up at the first kind of breakdown in communication. So I'd say there'd be, straight off the top of my head, there'd be 5 possibilities. Georgie, how are we doing for time, Mike? Past 11, okay. We'll take George and one more.
Okay. As a practical matter about speaking in person, Eva and I made an agreement before we got married that we'll always speak about things that are important in person because if I send you a tweet or a fax or a letter, you're reading the words and you're interpreting them based on where you are right now. If I call you, I'm adding inflections of my voice, which help me to communicate even better. And if I'm in person, I'm using body language, which helps to communicate even better. So I think anything important needs to be communicated in person.
That's brilliant, George. Absolutely right. So we're going to end with Jerry. It's gone 11 o'clock. You have your hand up, Jerry. Did you have your hand up? You didn't. You looked out, Lise.
So I think one of the things I love about community and the idea of talents, treasure, and time is that if we own our talents, you can be in alignment with God by being in alignment with your community. So having a senior moment here.
Sing.
I'm going to join the crones really soon.
Sing and it'll come back to you. Sing a verse of a song and it'll come back to you.
But what it had to do with was so alignment can bring out your own talents, and you have to own them, and you have to be willing to bring them up. I think another part of the conversation about how do you show that up, the entanglement, and the lovely woman sitting next to Steve. What is your name? Lisa. Hi, Lisa. I'm
Two
Lisa.
Lisas.
Okay. The other thing is, how do you then work with others in your communities to bring out their talents, or create the space for their talents? Because I know that sometimes in a competitive work environment, for example, somebody will look to squash the talents of another to let their own light shine. And so I think that's another side of this is, in our beingness with other folks, is to encourage them to use their talents as well.
Brilliant. So I had a client one time who was he was a professional actor, and his specialty was improv acting. And the system is particularly just two actors on stage, and they would stand on the stage and invite the community to just throw a word at them, and they'd have to create a drama around the word. So you could literally just stand on the stage and somebody would say, "Oranges," and then the two guys on stage have to make a drama around oranges. And he said there are only 2 rules to good improv. 2 rules. The first rule is that you never say no to a line that your partner feeds you. You can't quash any line that the person gives you. You got to work with whatever he throws at you. That's the first rule. And the second rule, he said, is your job is to make the other guy look good. So you will feed him lines that complement his talent. So you keep feeding him good lines that make him look really, really good. He's doing the same thing for you. So there are the 2 rules of it. You never say no. You work with whatever's thrown at you, and you feed your partner the best lines possible to kind of dovetail with his talent set. And that, for me, is what community is about as well. It is about working with whatever life throws at us and not saying no to anything, and about making the people in my life look good, not trying to make myself look good by quashing them. Guys, you've been very, very patient. Before we continue with our Eucharist, we're going to break and offer each other a sign of peace.